Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. Spain's government could be heading for its fourth general election of the past 4 years. Last week, the caretaker government of Socialist Party leader Pedro Sánchez failed to come to an agreement with the leftist Unidas Podemos party. The dispute between the center-left Socialist Workers' Party of Spain, or PSOE in its Spanish initials, and the Unidas Podemos party faltered on how many ministers and which ministries Podemos would be allowed to control. The decision now rests with King Felipe VI, who has until September 23rd to allow for new negotiations for a coalition government before Parliament is dissolved and new elections are called. The last elections were held on April 28th of this year, when no political party won an absolute majority, but the PSOE won a plurality of seats and thus had an opportunity to form a coalition government with other parties. Joining me now to discuss Spain's political impasse is Sebastiaan Faber. He is professor of Hispanic Studies at Oberlin College and author of the book Memory Battles of the Spanish Civil War. Welcome back to the Real News Network, Sebastiaan.
It's great to be back.
Give us a brief idea as to why these negotiations fell apart from your perspective. What were the disagreements about, and why could no agreement be reached?
There's a couple of strange things that happened in this whole process of negotiation. As you just said, the elections were at the end of April. So the parties had almost 3 months to negotiate an agreement between then and the vote that happened this past week. And yet the actual negotiations only occurred during the last couple of days. For a long time before that, nothing really happened. There was no real contact between the parties, and nothing resembling an actual negotiation with two parties sitting down, each with their position, trying to find a middle ground, happened. So there's a couple of questions why it took so long for the parties to do this, and why they waited for this very last minute. The initiative, most people agree, was really the socialist parties to take. So it was the socialists who waited strangely long with sitting down with Unidas Podemos. One reason they waited at least a month is because at the end of May, there were regional and municipal elections as well as European elections. So it kind of made sense for them to sit out those elections and then start negotiating seriously at the end of May, beginning of June, but that didn't happen either. Why they took so long to negotiate is a question that some people are connecting to potentially some bad faith on the part of the socialists. And the big question being asked now is, did the socialists actually want a coalition with Unidas Podemos, or did they just pretend to have one, pretend to negotiate, steering toward a failure of negotiation in order to blame Unidas Podemos for the failure of negotiation and force a repeat of the elections? One way to think about this is that there's, in the process of this process of negotiation, different competing interests were at play. One, of course, is the interest of the country. The country, for any party on the left, has a strong interest in having a progressive government, especially in a Europe where the right, especially the radical right, is on the rise everywhere. But there are also party interests. And for the socialists, Unidas Podemos is an electoral rival, even though ideologically they have a large amount of overlap. The socialists are slightly more centrist. Unidas Podemos is slightly more to the left. They have a strong shared political interests, political programs, but they're electoral rivals. In a context in which Unidas Podemos has been declining electorally, a couple of years ago, it was a big threat to the Socialist Party. It looked like it might be able to overtake the Socialist Party. These last elections showed a decline for Unidas Podemos and an important rise for the Socialists. So it could well be that the Socialists hoped to stage a failed negotiation in order to blame Podemos, in order to go in stronger for a next repeat of the elections. Another hypothesis is that the socialists really didn't want to ally themselves with Unidas Podemos to their left, but are really more looking for a centrist or a kind of a big coalition that crosses the aisle to the right, either with the Partido Popular, the Popular Party, the long-standing Conservative Party, or with the more recently created Ciudadanos or Citizens Party, which has a more neoliberal and lately a more nationalist, right-wing nationalist profile. So to make a long story short, The negotiations failed. There are strong indications that the socialists entered negotiations in bad faith and hoped for the failure that it eventually became. Interestingly, in these past couple of days before the final vote, Unidas Podemos was willing to cede much more than the socialists ever imagined. For example, Pedro Sanchez, the leader of the Socialist Party, at one point said, look, we're happy to enter into a coalition with Podemos as long as Pablo Iglesias, Unidas Podemos' leader, is not part of the cabinet, does not become a minister of government, which seemed like an extraordinarily bold demand to make. After all, Pablo Iglesias is the leader of Unidas Podemos, so it would only be logical that he as leader would also enter that government. Pablo Iglesias, however, the next day posted a video on Twitter in which he said, all right, I'm not going to be the obstacle for this one hope we have for a progressive government in Spain, so I'll step aside. I won't ask for a minister post for myself. I'll remove myself from the equation. That really called the socialists bluff. And for a little while, it seemed that the socialists, almost despite themselves, were going to have to agree to a coalition. And yet, still toward the last minute, the squabbling over what ministries Unidas Podemos would get in the government resulted in a failed negotiation and a failed vote of investiture this past week.
Now, some analysts have pointed out that Spain has a long history of having only one party or the other winning an absolute majority without the need for it to form a coalition with partners. Now there's no real culture, in other words, for forming coalitions. And this stands in contrast with a country such as Germany, where coalition governments have governed almost continuously since the end of World War II. Now, is the problem that with the Spain's system that it's so fragmented now that nobody can form a government without a coalition and that they don't have this experience? How do you see that?
Yes, I think that's definitely a factor. Spain is a young democracy. It became a democracy in the late 1970s after a long period of dictatorship. And it's true, like you say, that coalition governments have not been common at all. Strictly speaking, there has been no real coalition government yet. So that's definitely something that is a factor. The parties and the voters are not used to this process whereby parties present themselves with a program to elections and then water down that program in the process of negotiation as they enter a government with another party with different program points. So that's definitely a factor. That said, I want to also point out that even in the countries that have a long tradition of coalition governments, the Netherlands, Germany, for example, in recent years, it's become harder and harder to form coalition governments. It's been harder to find parties willing, more parties are needed, and parties have been more wary of entering coalition governments because recent patterns have shown that especially junior parties and partners in coalitions pay a steep electoral price at the next elections for having become part of a coalition in which they haven't really been able to push their own program quite as strongly. So in Europe as a whole, coalition governments have been harder to form. Spain, which has never had an opportunity to do so, also lacks the experience and both on the part of the coalitions, of the politicians, the practical experience of sitting down and the negotiation process and all that, but also on part of the voters who in countries like Holland and Germany have developed a kind of a tolerance for the idea that the party they vote for will have to reach a compromise with other parties in order to develop a government program, which is different from an electoral program with which they present themselves at the elections.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point about, in general, a trend against coalitions. In Germany, it actually took almost 6 months to form a government the last time around. So, but what happens now in Spain? Will there be new negotiations or will there be new elections? And if there are new elections, is this good or bad for Unidas Podemos, which did not do so well, as you mentioned, in the last election?
Well, strictly speaking, any parties have until September to come up with an agreement, basically with enough votes to support a candidate for the post of prime minister. That's how it works. If by September no such positive vote succeeds, then there's an automatic calendar that kicks in, and there'll be elections on November 10th. Should it come to those elections, at this point, it looks very likely that Unidas Podemos will continue its decline, will continue to lose voters and lose seats. The Socialist Party, according to a poll that came out today, stands to win, some say quite a bit, in new elections, despite its questionable role in these negotiations over the past month. But the big specter, the big fear that haunts the left in Spain is that new elections may lead to a historically low turnout among the left, voters on the left are extremely disenchanted and frustrated with this squandered opportunity for a progressive government in Spain. So it's likely many of them will stay home. At the same time that it's likely that many of the right will turn out. If that happens, it is a possibility that the three parties on the right gather enough votes to form a government so that Spain would switch over once again to a conservative government. This time, however, not formed only by the traditional conservative Popular Party, but with the support of Ciudadanos and with the support of Vox, Vox, this new party on the right, which came in for the first time in April with 24 seats in parliament. Doesn't look like it will grow much necessarily, but it may be, the Vox may provide the votes necessary to form a conservative government, and that would give it influence in a new government. And its program is strongly Spanish nationalist, anti-LGBTQ rights, anti-feminist, anti-immigrant, at the same time that it's adopting strongly neoliberal economic policies. So that is a real risk that new elections would bring.
Okay, well, we're going to continue to keep a very close eye on what's happening there, and maybe we'll come back to you very soon. I'm speaking to Sebastiaan Faber, Professor of Hispanic Studies at Oberlin College. Thanks again, Sebastiaan, for having joined us today.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.